Hi everyone, I just wanted to take a quick minute as we start Module 2 to do a brief overview of special ed law. Some of this might be a review for you, especially if you've taken EDSE 201 or you've had experience in any of this already. So Module 1, we were talking about inclusion. And so where do we start with all this? Prior to these laws being put into place, people with disabilities were institutionalized, isolated, weren't given the same opportunities as far as school. They weren't treated very well. And so, what happened is in the 1950s and 1960s and 70s, a lot of cases were put in front of against the Board of Education and others to try to make sure that people with disabilities were given the same rights as others. And that has led to this new legislation that is going to give children, the same opportunities as their peers. So in 1975, the Education of All Handicapped Students Act was put into place. That is now known as IDEA. So Education for All Handicapped Students Act was reauthorized in 1990, and its name changed to Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. Again, reauthorized in 1997, and the most recent reauthorization was in 2004. In order to qualify per IDEA for an individualized education program, or an IEP, a student needs to be eligible and meet certain criteria. So some of the criteria here, it may differ per state, like this is listed for the state of Colorado and the federal guidelines, so it may change. It may look a little bit different, but there are only certain categories: specific learning disability, intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, speech and language impairment, multiple disabilities, other health impairments, orthopedic impairments, hearing and vision impairments, autism, traumatic brain injury, and deafblindness. So like I said, in order for a student to qualify for an IEP, they need to meet those criteria. That doesn't mean that we can't help those other students that may have other disabilities in the classroom, but it might mean that they, receive a 504 plan or they receive support in a different way. So a little bit more about what is in IDEA. So there's 6 principles of IDEA. Zero reject, which is, every student is eligible for the same education. So every student is deserving, not some students, every student. Students deserve a non-discriminatory evaluation to find out if they have a disability and how it impacts their education. A student should have access to a free, appropriate public education that's provided tailored to meet their individual needs. They deserve a least restrictive environment. So the team's going to come up with how can we best educate that student to the maximum extent appropriate with their non-disabled peers. So for most students, that means the general education classroom. So how do we make that work? So we were talking in the last module about inclusion. So how do we make sure that a student, what do we need to put into place as far as services, accommodations, and modifications in order for a student to be taught and educated in the classroom with their non-disabled peers? Now, again, this is going to be individualized and it's going to depend on the student and be determined by the IEP team. There's provisions for procedural due process, safeguards for families and students if they disagree with something that the school district is talking about. There's provisions for parent and student participation in the IEP process, collaboration, and that's really what we're talking about in this whole semester, is that participation between, but not just the parents, but also the whole family, including the student. And what does that collaboration and that collaborative process look like? So a little bit more about zero reject. Again, it's everyone. All means all, not some students, but all students with disabilities have the right to education. and they have the right to be in the classroom. So again, that gets a little bit tricky because you want to be careful too, because a lot of times these students with disabilities, um, we need to look at expulsion and suspension as well, because you want to make sure that you're not expelling or suspending these students when their behavior might be something that is coming out of something that's addressed in an IEP. So for those students, we want to make sure that we talk about expulsion and suspension and behavior as part of an IEP plan if it's appropriate. Um, Again, I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but in IDEA, there's stay put provisions, manifestation. So, again, is their behavior a result of failure to implement part of an IEP? And is there danger? Is the student a danger to themselves or to others? And what is the reason for that? Is that something that is a direct result of something that could be addressed in an IEP? So for non-discriminatory evaluation, there's multiple steps here, and all the steps don't have to be taken in order. There's screening, pre-referral, referral, and then the evaluation. So pretty much in an educational environment, all students are sort of screened as the regular process. And pre-referral might mean that, a gen ed teacher might see something and say, we should probably just check that out a little bit more. And then, a team might talk about it and say, let's talk to the parent and refer a particular student for an evaluation. So that's what happens during that referral process. But again, during that referral process, you want to make sure that's a really stressful process for parents a lot of times. So you want to make sure that that referral process is done in collaboration with those families. And a parent actually has to approve an evaluation. You can't evaluate a student without parent approval. Again, evaluations performed by a variety of school personnel. It can be any of these, and it just sort of depends on the situation. There's a whole bunch of different types of tests, and later on in the semester, we're going to be talking about and doing a case study where we get to kind of walk through what an evaluation is going to look like. But here's a list of some of the things that you might be testing for. And then you're looking at, is there a disability? And not only is there disability, because a lot of times there might be a disability, but it's not impacting their education. So IDEA says you have to have both those components. So, if a student is doing really well in the classroom and their disability is not impacting, then they may not qualify for an IEP. Teams need to guard against cultural and linguistic bias on some tests. So it's really important to really look at what kind of testing you're going to be doing with a student. Like I mentioned, you want to make sure you get parent input on the evaluation team. So not just doing the test, but one of the things we'll learn about a little bit more later on in the semester is getting parent feedback on not only just doing a test, but what's going on at home too, so you can make sure that you're not only like figuring out what the best test is, but also just realizing that you may not be seeing the whole picture. And then you're compiling the data and making evaluation decisions as a team. So the family and the entire IEP team are making a decision. So you guys have maybe heard of the multi-tiered system of support in RTI. In Colorado, RTI was put into place in August 2009. And there's a link here for some more information. But essentially, that's sort of helping the process to identify students that may qualify, may need some additional assistance along the way. So it's a way to get through that referral process and give students that additional help, and to figure out if students are qualified and need to qualify for an IEP and be evaluated. So then there's FAPE, which means free education at a public expense, and it needs to be appropriate. So there's a couple of really important cases to know. So you may have heard the Raleigh case, which was in 1982. And so a family prevailed against the Board of Education in 1982. And what the judge had said is that we needed to provide, because a lot of IDEA it's up to, it's not very clear sometimes on, what does appropriate mean? Well, the judge in this case said, well, it means a Chevrolet, not a Cadillac. So it was really implying that we should do the very best that we can, but we don't have to provide the very best. Um, so that was really, for families, I think a lot of families may not have been happy about that, but it gave us the baseline from 1982 to figure out like what's appropriate for students. In last year, you guys may have heard on the news another major case, the Andrew F. case in Colorado, where a court ruled that it was the first time they'd ruled anything since Raleigh that was really this important, and it was that it was supposed to be more than de minimis benefit. So again, there's a lot of discussion about what does that mean? Is that more than a Chevy? Is that less than a Cadillac? Where is that going to be land? And what does that mean for students? And how do we implement that in the classroom? But again, all of this means the key is individualization. So it's the I in IEP and IFSP. So an IFSP, as a review, is for students that are birth to 3. That IEP, again, is an individualized education program that provides a foundation for the student to get the appropriate education and full participation in the school. It's reviewed at least once a year, and it provides movement from school to post school. And it has goals, it's very individualized, and each student who qualifies based on those criteria is going to have an IEP. IEP first starts, we're going to go at this in more detail, but it's going to start with where are they at now? What's their present level? And then it's going to, the team will talk about goals for that student. Then after we figure out goals, then you talk about special education services, aids, accommodations, modifications that they may need in order to reach those goals, and the extent to which the student will not participate with other students. So then after you talk about all these other things, then you can talk about the setting that might be appropriate for the student. Are they going to be in the gen ed classroom 100% of the time? Are they going to be in a resource room? Are they going to be in a separate classroom? What's that going to look like? We're going to talk about, again, modifications, end dates, how frequent are the services going to be? Is there a transition plan? And how is the progress going to be measured? So a lot of times we'll put goals in place, but it's really important that we make sure that we know who's going to measure it and how it's going to be measured and how our parents and families going to be informed of the progress. Again, IFSPs are birth to 3. So again, this is individualized family service plan. So it's talking about not only what are the needs of the child, but also the entire family. And this is reviewed on a more frequent basis than the IEP. We've already talked about our LRE. So first this was known as mainstreaming. Now it's referred to as inclusion. So this is what's the least restrictive environment? How do we get that student into the gen ed classroom as much as possible with their typical peers? And again, this benefits both the students with disabilities and their peers. We talked about this before. We must educate students with those without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. And we want to make sure that we always try for inclusion as much as possible. And we should talk about it as a team. If that's not possible, then that's a team decision. But that should always be the presumption when we're talking about the least restrictive environment. And we're talking about a continuum. So we talk about placement. We're talking about the least restrictive, which is the gen ed classroom. But you can see on the screen there's many different settings. For instance, for students who are deaf, they might be educated in their school for the deaf in their particular state, and that's going to be a special school. And in some cases, that might be the least restrictive environment. The family and the team might think that's the least restrictive environment for that particular student. But when we're talking about inclusion, which is what the goal of IDEA is, we're talking about trying to figure out a way to get the students in the gen ed classroom as much as possible. Procedural due process, we'll get into that at the very end of the semester, but parents have rights like mediation, due process. There's some other things, state complaints that they can do if they don't agree with the decisions of the IEP team in the school district. And we'll get into this more as well, but parent-student participation. So parents are critical active members of the team. They need to be invited to all meetings. They need to have meaningful input on placement decisions, and they can have access to all records of their child. There's two other laws that I'll mention. So it's Section 504. So that's when I talked about that a little bit more in the accommodations and modifications lecture, but I'm going to list it here. And then ADA. So the ADA is more it's for the private sectors, not just schools. So that's going to make sure that, that students have access to the schools. There's handicap ramps. There's, that they can get into every room that every their peers can. So anyway, that's a really, really quick overview of special education law. I know that's a lot of information and a lot of detail. So if you have any questions at all, let me know. Have a good week.